Welcome, everybody, to the Saturday Night Bee Chat. Don has got something he'd like to talk about, winterizing beehives. Let's wait a few more minutes, Don, if you want, because the chat isn't full yet. But a lot of people don't come in right till 8 o'clock. How about a leadoff question to get everybody going here, and then after that it'll be 8. We got about 5 minutes to kill. So I've seen in in a video where you're talking about your feeder box and you walk through the various inceptions, the various models you make of your feeder. And I was wondering, do you sell a pre-built milk jug hive top feeder? And if so, what sizes are they available in?
We make them in 5 frame. We make them in 8 frame. Those are the two sizes that we do, but we can make some in 10 frame. I try to steer people away from 10 frame. They're just basically obsolete, but there's die-hard beekeepers that won't give up 10 frame stuff. So we do make them. We have shipped some in the past, but shipping usually costs about as much as the feeders. That's why we have downloadable plans that are easy to follow, and most people can build them themselves or have some local woodworker that's in their club possibly build them for them.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned a club. I tried to join a club here in North Dakota and nobody would get back to me. They have a North Dakota Beekeepers Club, and there's a chapter here in this area, next county over. Counties are pretty small here, so it's not too far. And yeah, I just, everybody's either so busy or so disgruntled or so, something that they really don't have a lot of you were the only way I could find anything out about bees. So other than
Well,
reading books.
if you're trying to contact bee clubs and they're not letting you in, maybe it's a kind of a closed club or something. I've had people and I've just joked around with them and I've said, tell them Fat Bee Man and be surprised. Doors start opening. People want to listen. They want to hear a different side of beekeeping that I try to give to people.
Yep.
It's more common sense type version.
Well, it's almost 8 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and open up the chat, and everybody who comes in later will come in later. Hold on, let me see how I take this to a Q&A mode. I know there's a way to do that. Hold on real quick. Q&A mode.
All
Okay,
attendees are muted and may unmute themselves by pressing *6.
At this point, you guys are all unmuted, but you have to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. You can raise your hand. There should be a little interact icon, and one of the options in there should be raised hand, and we'll know you have a question, and then we'll unmute you and take that question. Not everybody's going to see that. If you're on a phone or you're on a smartphone, you may not see that. So. Or anything but a PC. I've heard the Mac doesn't work all that well. There's Joe. Joe just popped in. So if anybody's got a question, raise your hand. If not, I will ask another question from my monstrous list of questions I have for Don. There's Herschel. Herschel just walked in. How you doing, Herschel? All right, I don't see any. Oh, there's Herschel. What do you got for us, Herschel? You got a question?
Nothing yet. I'm just going to listen in for a little while.
And there's Malcolm. Malcolm just popped in. I see his camera on. Malcolm, you got any questions? Joe's got a question. Let's take Joe. Let's take Joe. Okay, Joe, you should be unmuted. Just unmute your microphone and go ahead and tell us what your question is.
Yes, last week when you were on the raised hand deal, once I asked a question, it wouldn't clear itself, and then when I tried to ask another question, it would never do anything.
Well, if you go to that interact button and you click it again and change your mood back to I'm fine, the hand will go away.
Oh, okay. I didn't know I had to do that. I thought maybe it was automatic.
No, it's just a mood setting. It's because of in a webinar you get so many people and they all try to talk. Somebody tries to talk at the same time, they end up stomping all over each other's audio. So we prefer people use it, just leave themselves muted until they have a question, and then we know they have a question when they raise their hand. So if you turn that off right now, Joe, it'll go off. But if you still have a question, go ahead.
Hey Don, I had a couple splits here last week that robbers was robbing awful bad, and they killed the queens, or they was mated queens because they had queen cells in them. Is there a way I can stop that robbing? I got robbing screens on them.
Well, I don't particularly use robbing screens. I just reduce the entrances down. And like if they're robbing out of 8-frame hive, you just need to close it down to maybe 2 inches wide and 3/8 high. But most of the 5-frame, when I got entrance reducers in there, they're 3/8 of an inch high and about 1 inch wide. And springtime, I don't even use reducers because there's so much coming in at one time. They usually won't rob. If you have a robin situation now, a lot of times it's coming from a weak hive due to wax moth, small hive beetles, or it could be just that they're not flying, they're not getting enough nectar coming in, and that's causing them to rob.
Right. Well, I've got them cut down to 3/8 but 3/4 hole, and when they killed the queens, there wasn't a lot of brood in there. Now they have 2 frames of brood that's hatched out, so they should be all right, I would think.
That might help them. But tonight we're going to try to go over like checking for winter and getting your hive, in shape for winter or going into spring. And we start like on the outside of the hive. You can just walk around. If you got more than one hive and you don't want to go through every single one, the first thing you do is just do a little walk around. The next thing you just go to the rear of the hive and lift it up and see if it's got weight to it. If it doesn't have enough weight, then you might have to do some feeding. Then the next thing to do is go look around the front, look on the ground, check for pupa, dead bees, and stuff like that they've hauled out. The next thing I would do is pull out your entrance reducer, take your hive tool and stick it in about 1 inch or so and just slide it sideways and see if you can drag out anything in there. Look at the entrance reducer, check for any kind of worms, maggots, or anything like that. That way, you don't have to go into the hive. If you've got some black pepper looking stuff right underneath that entrance reducer, then more than likely you've got some wax moth in there. You're getting the eggs there. So it would be the next step is to go do a full inspection of the hive. And at that point, what I would do is put a level on your hive and make sure that when you lay the level there, you can stick a quarter up under the front side of it. And then when the quarter is under the level and the level's reading level, you have enough fall to it. The very minimum, a dime. If you have a dime on there and it's showing level, that would be very minimal. The next thing I'd like to see is have the hives up at least knee high off the ground, keep the moisture out. And as you're going through to make your inspections, if you're running hive queen excluders, take them off. Make sure you don't have queen excluders on going into the winter. If you have a queen excluder, it's going to keep the bees from moving up into the honey super, and they can actually starve. Bees could get up there and leave the queen behind, and when the queen dies, then the rest of the hive is going to die. I would go through the hive frame by frame, check the bottom board, look for debris, look for eggs, wax moth eggs, or small hive beetle eggs. If you see very much, change the box out. Put another box there, another bottom board, and then pull frame by frame and check it. One side, then the other. Look for a stretch comb. Check and see if you got a queen that's laying. Check for the amount of honey you got in there. And then also then put your next box on and go through that and check, see if the frames are good condition. If you got ample stores going into the winter, and smell the frames. They should smell like honey and smell good. If they have a sour smell, you got fermenting honey. Might be a time to get that out of there. And then you just close the hive up. If you're running hive top feeders, make sure you got ventilation in the back so that you don't get mildew and moisture build up in there. And from that point, we can take some questions. I know people's probably got some answers, some questions, some things they do. I know a lot of people like to use the dry sugar method. It's okay, when you're going into November, February, if you're really running low on feed and you don't have honey to feed your bees, the dry sugar method is probably one of the better ways to do it. And that can be done with either a paper towel or a newspaper across the top of the frames. 2 to 3 cups of sugar is sufficient to keep the bees from starving.
Don, Debbie's got a question about what is the difference between feeding pollen and feeding syrup in a community feeder? Are either recommended or not recommended?
If you're going to feed pollen, I would feed it in the syrup on the hive. I wouldn't community feed because it's going to draw a lot of yellow jackets and wasps to it because it's got an yeast smell to it and it attracts, your predators like your yellow jackets and that. If they're bringing any pollen in at all, I don't even recommend feeding pollen substitutes because you just stimulate the growth of small hive beetle in the hive.
All right, and Herschel's got a specific question about when wintering over, would you recommend using both a candy frame and a quilt, or will a properly ventilated candy board be sufficient?
If you got that ventilation going in there through the hive box, and if you have a super, that has ventilation, and if you're running a hive top feeder and it has ventilation, then I don't think you're not going to need any additional. Putting a quilt up there, or people like to put other stuff up there. And I think all that ends up doing is just building up a place for the moisture to build up. And then you got this, if you got really cold temperatures, you got an icicle up over the top of them bees.
All right. Bill wants to know, though, if we do a full inspection, will the bees have time to seal everything up, basically repropolize everything? How long does it take them to seal it back up after you've done an inspection anyway, Don?
I've had people come up and tell me that they only go in their hive 2 times or 3 times a month. And they swear that it takes a long time for them bees to seal that box down. And I've actually pulled a super off in springtime or midsummer, set it to the side, and the person that's there that's doubting that, I will stick it back on the hive and tell them to reach over and pull it up. And they'll get over there and they'll jerk it and jerk it and jerk it. That propolize is just like Velcro. You're not going to pick it up. I mean, it seals itself right then. But people have this idea it's going to take 2-3 weeks to seal it up. If they've ever pulled honey and set the box back down on another super that had been on the hive, it'll stick to it. You need a hive tool to pry it up. And at that point, usually I show people, instead of sticking your hive tool under and popping one corner up and trying to lift it straight up, lift one corner up just 1/4 of an inch and then take the box like you're unscrewing a lid. Turn it, it breaks that seal, and it's a whole lot easier to lift, and you don't pull the muscles in your back. It's a little thing that I learned over years of lifting box after box.
Okay, Debbie's got an addendum to her question. She says, whoop, I'm getting some feedback. Hold on. Let me see where that's coming from. It looks like it went away. There we go. Okay. Debbie wants to know what she's asking is, do you recommend community feeding of syrup or not?
I do a community feeding of syrup a lot, but right now they should be working goldenrod pretty good. You should have a good flow of honey or nectar coming in right now. Now, if you're making splits and stuff in the fall, you might have to add feed to them. If there's anything at all coming in, they're not going to get in a community feeder. We've had rain here, tremendous amount of rain, and I've got about 8 or 10 5-gallon buckets out there. And between the raindrops, we're getting a few bees up on it. If you don't mind community feeding and feeding other people's bees or whatever, I mean, it's not going to do any harm. It'll probably do more good than harm.
I know that's a subject of deep contention for some people. They just feel that community feeding is the worst possible thing you could do. I guess they're afraid of bee infections and, spreading diseases, I guess. That would be my thought.
Well, I've never heard of that really spreading disease. Now, if your hives are robbing out other people's hives, and years ago, old beekeepers had hives that died out, never got them inspected. If you had foul brood and there's any old honey in that hive and you've stored it out in a barn or something, I could see there that you could be spreading disease. That's one way to spread it. But feeding sugar syrup, I've never heard of a way to spread disease that way.
All right. So, Joe, did you still have a question, or are you done?
Yeah, Don, do you reduce your hive entrances in the wintertime, or like a 5 frame, you leave them open?
I run about a 1 inch maximum on 5 frame and about 3 to 4 inches on the 8 frame. You're running a 10 frame, 5, 6 inches is maximum I'd run on a 10 frame. But most people's already gone away from the 10 frame to 8 frame stuff. And going into winter, one thing I like to do, and I suggest to other beekeepers, rather than pumping in Fumidel B or Fumagellin, is put 2 teaspoons of tea tree oil in a blender with a cup of water, blend it up, mix it in a gallon of sugar syrup, and you got a good antifungal, antibacterial going in that hive. That helps eliminate your chalk brood and stone brood. You don't have this dysentery going into the winter. And it's a lot cheaper than buying Fumidel B or Fumagellin.
All right. Anybody else got a question for Don? You can go over to the little interact icon and raise your hand, and you'll come right up to the top, or you can type it in the chat. Oh, Rita's got one here, or let's see, Malcolm's got one. Let me back up. Malcolm says, I didn't check a hive a ways from my other hives, and when I did, the bees had left, and there were other bees robbing it out. The wax worms had moved in. All I knew to do was set the frames out and let the bees finish robbing what they wanted. Then he says, the next day I just picked up the frames back in the with moth crystals to kill the worms and eggs. Was that the correct thing to do?
I I personally don't use the crystals. If you have a lot of the worms, the webbing, if it's real severe, pull out the webbing that you can get. And if there's enough comb left, if you have fire ants, set it on a fire ant hill and they'll clean it out. But the best thing to do is clean that stuff out, melt it down. Winter time is the time that we cull frames, clean the propolis off frames, and we get ready for going into spring. And we're making wax right now to set up our hives in that for springtime. So if you have wax worms, if you're putting a crystal on it, paramoth or any other substance that's supposed to kill that wax moth, you are contaminating your wax, and that wax is not good for reuse.
Right. Okay. Rita says, what do you think of having only an entrance at the top of the hive?
I don't prefer that because I've had hives that the entrance end up getting plugged up because of a die-off as far as your drones going into winter. And once that bottom gets clogged up, then you get decomposing bees. Now, people that's coming up with this hive with the top entrance, I don't know where they're coming off at, but if you stop and think common sense, if you have dead drones at the bottom of the hive and your 2 boxes high, it takes a lot of energy for that worker bees to haul that drone up to the top and pull it out that entrance. That's why a bottom entrance is so much better. It's easy for the undertaker bees to haul out the dead and keep that bottom free and clear.
All right. Well, Don, it looks like things are quiet in the chat here, so I have a question. In one of your videos where you talked about culling the wax out, you showed how you cut it out with a knife, and that's really helpful. But then you mentioned that there was propolis on the frames and that you'll get that out or get that off of it in the spring. Well, how do you do that? How do you get that propolis off?
I have a steak knife, which is basically I've dulled it with a file so that it's not real sharp. It's just basically a thin bladed knife, and I scrape the propolis off of the sides of the frame where the frame rest is, and I put it in a container, and I save it until I have a sale for it. That's what I consider number one propolis. I don't run propolis screens to collect it. I just do it off the frames or the frame rest. And occasionally you'll get some on the lids or on the sides of the boxes where the boxes stack up. I don't prefer to say that because usually when you scrape it, you're scraping some debris. You're going to get wood chips in there, and it doesn't bring as good a price. But if you're careful and you clean those frames, you got to clean them anyhow. Because if there's a buildup of propolis there, it changes the spacing of the frames and you get wider comb on one, narrower on the other.
That makes
I
sense
tend
if
to do
you let it
things at
build up.
once there.
Yeah. All right. Anybody else got a question? No? Just raise your hand or you can type it into the chat. Well, let's move on. Let's see here. So more about since we're coming into winter and fall here in the videos where you talked about culling frames in September, you want that because in the spring you want to be going in with 4.9 worker cells. That is correct?
Yes. You want
Okay.
all worker cells. You don't want stretch cells or a lot of old drone comb in there because you want as many workers as possible.
Okay. Well, I guess my question is then, how do you call a frame in a brood chamber? I mean, what if it has brood in it? Do you cut it? Do you just pull it out, cut it away? How do you do that?
You can manipulate the frames to where you slide them to the outside of the box, or if you've got 5 frame nuke boxes that you've set up, you take the frames that you're culling out and you throw them in a 5 frame box. And then you let the brood hatch out. And if it's just honey, I designate 2 or sometimes 3 5 frame boxes that have solid bottoms on, and I just stack the frames in there that's got honey, and I let them use it as an open feeding area, and I just let them rob it out. And when the bees rob it out, then I take it and I cut the frame and cut it out. And I use a solid bottom because if there's very much sealed honey in there, all that wax cuttings, you'll find a ½ inch of cuttings, wax cuttings in there, and it's good usable wax. So you got to melt it down, save it. That's your seed for next year setting up your hives. Either that or you're going to have to buy foundation and take that chance that it has chemical in it. And that's one thing that I've learned by making my own foundation. Your hives are healthier. When you buy foundation, you have no idea where it came from. It could come from China, it could have chemicals. Let's say some large operation had a big kill off or it had some kind of disease in there. The most logical thing that they're going to do is melt all their comb down, salvage what they can, clean up what they can, and all that old comb, melt it down in blocks, take it up to a bee supply house. They don't have no way to test it. They'll make it up in a foundation and pass it on to somebody else. So know the history of your wax going into your hive.
So as a follow up on that, okay, so you take the frame out. Now spring is coming. You want to build the hive up. What do you replace it with? Just starter strips, 4.9 wax foundation? What do you do?
If you are going to feed a lot and there's not much of a honey flow, you would use at least a full sheet or use a half sheet. If what I'm doing is if there's a honey flow and I'm feeding at the same time, I prefer a starter strip. My wax goes 4 to 5 times further. Wax is pretty expensive, you know. I have cakes of wax that, valuation on wax that has absolutely no chemical in it is $20, $25 a pound. People buy it for cosmetic purposes. They don't want any trace of any kind of chemical in it.
That's an interesting point. You can sell it to medical grade beeswax that way. So
Well,
used to
there's
work
more
for.
and more people that's making lip balms and salves, cosmetics, and they want that stuff that's clean as possible.
Yeah, I used to work for Eli Lilly, who at the time owned Elizabeth Arden, and one of their big things was getting good bee wax for their foundations and their their eyeshadows and stuff like that. Apparently, if it's got any junk in it, it'll can cause an allergic reaction to people. So good
Right.
point. Okay, we got a question from Debbie. Do you put roofing paper on your hives? I know what she's talking about, where you wrap the hive in like a tar paper.
No, I don't do that. And even when I lived in Ohio, I never got into it. I didn't see that it did that much good. Bees will survive in trees as long as you don't have moisture in the hive and you have proper ventilation. You don't have a problem. Bees have a funny way of keeping themselves warm even when the temperature drops down. They go into a partial hibernation or almost a suspended state. In fact, one of my first experiences with that was when I was about 13 years old. And I lived in northern Ohio, and the temperature had dropped down really cold for about a week. And I went out there when the temperature came back up in the 40s, 48 degrees. I opened the hive up, and here I had bees just in a cluster. I piled them on the bottom. So I ended up thinking they was dead. So I dumped all the bees out on the ground, shook all the bees off the frames, took the stuff up to the garage and was talking to my dad about it. And I went back out about 3 hours later, and the sun had been up a little bit. And it was early afternoon, temperature probably come up into about 50, 52. And I walked out there and I noticed a few bees moving around in that. Went back and I told my dad about it. He said, "We'll just take the whole hive back there and set it back in there." And luckily enough, the queen was in that cluster. I never disturbed it, but they was basically in a suspended state. And they came back and they actually made it through the winter.
That's
I would have marked
fascinating.
that hive off.
Oh yeah, dump them on the snow-covered ground. Yeah. Well, it probably wasn't snow-covered, but it was cold. Let's put it that way. Okay, so Les has got a question. He says that he has heard you say that you would make 18 splits off of a double 10-frame box. Is it correct? Correct to say that you would wait until you have either queen cells ready to go before you split that hive?
Yes. Or laying queens. Either one. I prefer putting queen cells in with one frame of bees or just a frame of honey and shake some bees. I mean, if you're going to make numbers, you have to do a few things that's a little more drastic and don't have to follow the pack, what everybody else says you have to do.
Right, right. And you're putting fewer bees at risk if this queen doesn't come back, gets caught by a bird, whatever, when she's out
Right.
mating. So,
That's the main thing. You don't want to take a lot of your resources and put them in a 5 frame box. And if they don't come back, you've lost a pound to 3 pounds of bees. Where if you're doing 1 frame and 5 frame nuke boxes, you could make 5 to 6 splits off of that. And even a lot more if you're using mini nukes. You can only use, one queen cell and a cup of bees. That's all it takes.
right. So he also asked, how early can you put the feed to the hives in the spring and get them compressed, or I guess he means honey bound to make queen cells?
I start usually in February, and I start my making of queen cells when I see red maples blooming, and I see the bees starting to bring plenty of pollen in. When the pine trees are blooming and it's blowing out big clouds of yellow, you can make all the queens you want. And it's just hard to make a mistake then because everything is working in your favor. In the fall, you've got to watch what you're doing because things are a little bit different in the fall than they are in the spring.
Right. Okay. So I got a couple people with questions here. Let's take one from Malcolm. Go ahead and unmute your microphone, Malcolm. You're ready to ask your question. Malcolm, you need to unmute. Oh, there you go. Go ahead.
Yeah, Don, when I was looking at one of your videos the other night, when you went into a 5 frame nuke, of course, you only had like 3 frames in there, and you had 2 frames that had cells on them. And am I assuming correctly that these are frames that you took out of a hive that was already making emergency cells and stuck them in there with a few bees to attend them until they got ripe and ready to cut out?
No, not necessarily. If you was to follow me around my bee yard, we run several hundred 5 frame nukes, and you're not going to find very many of those nukes that's got 5 frames in there just for one main reason. If you have 5 frames in there, it takes time to pull one frame out and set it on the outside of the hive to work that hive. If you're running 2 and 3 frames, you're in and out a whole lot quicker. And most of the 5 frame boxes, we pull a queen out. If we don't have a queen cell to go right back, we mark it and then we'll come back and check it. And usually it's making its own queen cells. So we have different bricks on there to tell us what's going on. Sometimes there'll be a 5 frame hive out there with 2 frames and maybe 10 cells on each frame. So when we sell a queen, then we go to them hives and it's like our little queen bank. We go in there with our steak knife and we cut out 1 or 2 cells and we take them up and put them in where we just took out the queen, and we replace them with the ripe cells. So you have to have a way to mark your boxes so that you know what stage they're in. Either they're making queen cells, or there's cells in there, or that there's cells that has to be cut right away. And those are the ones we mark with 3 bricks. Those got to be cut within 24 hours, or we're going to lose anywhere from 3 to 10 or 15 cells in one box.
Okay, so not only are you compressing yours down to make swarm cells, you're also just setting the supplies out there for the bees, as I call it, for them to make their own queens. You're setting a lot of
Right.
them out there that are queenless, right, for emergency
Right.
cells.
Yeah. Well, I'm getting lazy as I'm getting older, so I let the bees make their own cells. I don't have to sit back there and graft. And I think the bees, when they make their own cells, is a whole lot better than sitting there trying to graft. I mean, you can have 20 boxes out there, and your odds that you're going to have good queens out of 20 boxes is probably 100 to 200%. Where if you're sitting back there and wasting your time, I mean, you can sit there for an hour and hope you're going to get good grafts. If you pull that larva up that cell and you roll it just a little bit, or when you go to depositing your queen cell and you flip it or bump it, you can't see it, but the other bees, they're looking at it, they can see it. So the bees that make their own cells is a far superior queen, in my opinion.
Well, let me ask one last question, and then I'll let everyone else talk tonight. Um, do you ever try to introduce virgin queens to a hive?
I have, but usually when we put a queen in a 5 frame or cell into a 5 frame box, we let it go through the natural process of hatching, flying out, mating, and returning. Of course, we go back in 3 days, 4 days. If the queen is not returned, your returns in spring is a whole lot more than they are midsummer or even fall. But once she starts to lay, we give her a day to 2 days laying. Then we cage her and when we pull that queen, replace it with a ripe cell, and it's ready to go again.
Thank
All
you.
righty. Okay, well, Joe's got a question. Let's unmute. Joe, go ahead. What's your question?
Yeah, Dawn, in the spring, what's the temperature that the queen will start picking up and building the brood up for the summer?
Well, if you're feeding, the temperature to stimulate the queen can be about 55 to 60 degrees. But I've been out there at 40 degrees, 42 degrees, and I've seen bees flying. But I don't go in my hives when the temperature's like that. And I don't try to transfer cells and stuff when the temperature's anywhere 55 or below. It needs to be above 55 with enough bees to keep your cells warm.
Okay, you're talking daytime highs or when you're working them,
Right.
right?
And I've had people say, the queen shuts down in the wintertime. This is not a very true fact, because the queen is going to lay 12 months of the year. And that's just nature replacing nature in case something happens to that queen. Now, you could go in there, I don't care if you live clear up in Minnesota, go out there on a day in January, February when the temperature's up 55 degrees, if you have a day like that, and go to the center of that brood chamber and pull it out and look at it quick, you'll find a minimum of 2 to 3 inch circle of eggs and larvae at all stages, at least 3 frames. That's just nature. The queen, people say it shuts down and that's why, they don't have no bees. It's not true. The older bees is dying off, but there's always bees there to replace that queen if need be.
Okay, thank you, Don.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. That the bees are never going to leave themselves stranded. They're never going to leave all the eggs infested in one queen. That's a good point. Alrighty, let's see if anybody else has got a question. If not, I will ask another one from my list. Oh, you know what? I do believe that Jimmy on this mobile phone here, I'm going to unmute you, Jimmy. And if you have a question, go ahead and ask it because you were trying to get on last week and we had a little meeting on the side and confirmed that he could get on just with his mobile phone. So now you have no microphone available, Jimmy. So you must not want to ask a question today. So we'll just move on to somebody else. Let's see. Keister's Honeybee Rescue has a regular phone. I'm going to unmute you, Keisters, and if you got a question, give it to us. You're unmuted. Go ahead. No? Keister's Honeybee Rescue, you don't have any questions? All right. Well, I got one in the chat. Rita says, if you lost a queen in the late fall, say November, is it possible for the hive to make it through the winter without or make a new queen even? Would they make a new queen, Don?
Well, if they make a new queen, the next thing is you got to have enough warm weather, and you have to have some drones. I've had people, call and say, they need a queen bad, and we can't ship queens out or we're out of queens. As long as they have drones, more than one hive, they're going to have enough drones. But if possible, I would put a mated queen in November. You shouldn't have no problem. Everybody's experience with hives in the fall is different. A more seasoned beekeeper knows what to look for, and a novice beekeeper or a one-year beekeeper doesn't know the things to be looking for. But I would say as long as you had drones and you had larvae that was young enough, they would make themselves a queen. The next thing, you got to have good flying weather. And if she's in North Carolina, she's probably got a lot of rain like we got, so you're not going to get much flying weather.
Don't mean to brag, but since I'm going to freeze my keister off up here in North Dakota, it was over 80 degrees today here. Beautiful sunny skies. We had a little bit of clouds here and there, but we'll take it because last year at this time there was already snow on the ground. So we've been having a really blessed fall up here, a really long fall and that's awesome because the winters here can be so long. Bill wants to know, will your new queen mate with drones from the same hive?
Most of the time they try to find other drones, but they will mate with other hive. And that brings up a question about inbreeding. People that have hives that they bought packages or bought nukes, they say, oh, I work the hive all the time. And then they go into the next year and they say, that hive is so mean, it just eats you up. It's basically a sign of inbreeding. When the hive is basically constructed of the queen, which is a female bee, what was once a worker bee, you've got female bees and the drone bees, which is the brother sisters of the hive. So when you start getting the inbreeding of that hive, the genetics goes to pot and they usually get ill. That's one of the first signs of them. The next sign is a lot of drone brood they're building up in there. They're trying to replace the queen, but they don't have the good genetics to do it.
That's interesting, Don, because I see people over on the Facebook and I see them here and there and other places, and they go on about how their bees are so dang mean that there's no way you'll work them without a suit. And even with a suit, they tend to get stung. What other than inbreeding, what else can it be? Just sick bees? They got a lot of mites or what?
No, a lot of times you can have a hive that is real mellow and go out there the following week and work them, and you think you've got, a Dr. Hyde and Jekyll Hyde there, because what's happening is if you got little lizards or these geckos, they are up underneath the hive and they're picking off lunch. They're got sitting there and they're picking the bees off. Or you could have a skunk, you could have a possum there, and that will make a hive get real defensive real quick.
That's an interesting point. Somebody in Facebook, a guy by the name of Tim, pointed out that he looked and his bees were just like Satan possessed, and he just going crazy. Come to find out, he had a skunk coming around at night and scratching the hive and getting the bees riled up, and then he'd eat them as they come out. He
Yep.
put down carpet tacks on a piece
Right.
of wood or something, and the skunk can't get in there now and can't get them. And he says they went right back to being mellow as possible. So I guess it's just having a good eye to see what's going on here in this hive when I'm not here right now.
Well, that's one reason why if you have, more than one hive or a half a dozen or more than that, is to walk around the hive and visually look at the hive. If you see a hive, and well, that's one thing I try to tell people when they're buying bees. Buy two hives, because if you don't have the experience and you look at one hive and they're bringing pollen in and the other one's not, then you have a problem there. So you know what you're looking for. But you can walk around through your bee yard, you see all the hives bringing pollen in. That's a pretty good sign you've got a queen in there is laying, because they're not going to bring excessive amounts of pollen unless you got a queen in there and she's laying. The pollen is designated for baby food. They mix it with the nectar and they feed it to the young developing bees. If there's no queen in there and that you've got some brood in there, they're going to haul nectar. They'll be busy hauling nectar, but they're not going to bring pollen in. So that's one sign that I kind of look for. Hive that's not bringing pollen, I go in it right away to look for things.
Is there something else that won't bring pollen in, even if they have a good queen?
Well, if they're getting a lot of Varroa, they're not apt to go out and do it. Or if there's just rainy weather, they're not going to bring pollen. But bees are going to haul pollen almost year round. I've had them here in December, January hauling pollen. The dandelions come in, they start bringing pollen in around 10 o'clock.
Well, that's fascinating. Malcolm wants to know, do you sell and ship virgin queens?
I don't believe in shipping or even selling virgin queens. I mean, if a beekeeper comes with a sad story, I'll give him a virgin queen, but it's just bad business, because if you sell it to an inexperienced beekeeper, that queen has to fly out and mate. And if it flies out and takes all the bees with it and doesn't return, and then pretty soon you get a bad name. This guy's queens ain't no good. My hive left. So that's why you want to sell a queen that's mated and, that's not going to fly out and mate.
Well done. Keisters has got a question, and I'm going to have him ask it. I'm going to unmute you here. Keisters, you're unmuted. Go ahead and ask that question. Can you unmute your microphone? I can read it if you'd prefer. He said he had his mic muted, so there you go. Go ahead.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, I wanted to know if I can save some drone comb, frames of drone comb in the freezer for the winter, and put those back in the hive in the spring to basically force maybe some early drones, or how can I get the earliest drones so I can get my splits going real early and be able to get the queens mated?
Well, it's kind of hard to push nature, I think. When you put drone comb in a freezer, you're doing two things. You're messing up your freezer. I wouldn't want to put my food in the freezer. Second is you're causing the bees to have to work extra hard to uncap that brood, haul all that dead stuff out, and then you run the risk if the hive's not strong enough and they don't haul it out, it starts to rot or decay in there and cause the hive to abscond. There's no need to add drone comb to any hive. Nature, when it needs to replace itself, they'll make all the drone comb they need. Now, I've done studies myself on when hives are going to swarm. And by just putting an empty frame, you take a deep box and put a medium or a shallow frame in the middle and watch what the bees draw. If they draw that whole frame out with worker cells, and then from the bottom board down to the bottom bar down to the bottom board, and that's all worker cells, you got a good queen in there. But if they draw just inside that frame worker cells, and then the bottom on that bottom bar downward to the same length that other frames are, which would be deeps, and that's all drones, that queen is they're going to swarm in about 3 weeks. That's how they prepare to swarm. They get drones going about 3 weeks before they're getting ready to swarm. That's how I check queens to see how they're good. And if you don't think that's a good way to do it, think about a tree. You cut a tree down or take bees out of a house, you'll find perfect comb in there. No one put foundation in there. They didn't go in a tree and put foundation, and you got perfect comb in there. But towards the bottom, you'll find a big section where there's nothing but drones. That's where they replace the queen.
Yep, I mean, it's a sign they're going to swarm. Keisters, are you done, or did you want to ask another question?
Well, basically, just start feeding as early as I can and wait till I see some drones, is what you're saying.
Yep, that's the best thing to do. They'll make drones by themselves when they're ready.
When the conditions are right.
I have a freezer that I do use strictly for the bee stuff because I put a lot of frames of honey in there until I can get to extracting them. I mean, is that a good way to keep my honey safe from everything?
Well, whenever you do that there, you run the risk of increasing moisture content in your honey. And then you run a risk of it crystallizing a lot faster too. I try to leave, if you're not going to have time to extract honey, I would leave it on the hive. The bees can take care of it a whole lot better than what you're going to be able to take care of it. And as far as the extracting honey, I've had people come up here and kind of scratch their head and see when I'm taking honey off. If it's in the fall, I cut that comb out. I do not use comb again the following year out of honey supers. I always put new comb in every year. Makes a big difference making honey.
Well, would it be okay to leave, I'm running all deeps, would it be okay to leave a whole extra deep of honey on there, 10 frames for the winter?
It's not going to hurt it. It's going to cause the bees to eat a little bit more. If you had a shallow on there or a medium, they're going to use a lot less honey because you've got more cubic inches in there for the bees to heat. So they're going to eat more honey to create more heat. If anything, what I would do is pull that honey off, extract it, put it in jars. If you have to feed it back, feed it back. If you don't need it, you eat it.
Okay, well, I was pulling all of what I thought they don't need off, but I wasn't having time to extract it yet, so I was keeping it in the freezer. I just didn't want my bees getting into it. I didn't really have another good place to store it out of their way.
I would left it on the hive. The bees will protect it more than what you're going to be able to protect it. If you store it in a building, or if you're putting it in the freezer, you run that chance of picking up moisture. If you store it in a building, and if you put a lid on the bottom of your supers and then stack 2 or 3, put another lid on it, if you don't get it extracted in 24 hours, you run a high risk of getting beetles in it. The beetles can smell honey sitting out and they'll just go to it.
Those guys can fly. I've seen videos of them just swarming around hives.
Yep.
Well, Keisters, is that it? Is that the last question you had?
Yeah, that was all I had for tonight. Thanks, Don.
Great.
Appreciate it.
Okay.
All righty. Well, I'm going to mute you then, and we'll move on to the next question, which is from Mark Rendell. He wants to know, how often will you treat for Varroa using vapor from oxalic acid vapors?
For me or for him?
Well, he's probably talking from his
His point of
perspective.
view?
I don't think you're not a real big producer. I don't think, Mark. You're kind of like me. You're just getting started. He's maybe got 6 hives or something like that. So
If I was him, I would treat it once a week. Myself, I try not to treat myself here. I let the students treat as a training thing for them. But there's times we don't treat for 2 months, sometimes 3 months. But when I treat, I might have 3 or 4 students out there, each weekend doing a different section, treating, a dozen, 2 dozen, till they get tired or get bored with what they're doing. A lot of it's they get monotonous.
right, but you would recommend that if you don't have an experienced hand and eye for Varroa mites, treat once a week for how many weeks?
If you've never treated before, I would treat every 2 weeks, 3 treatments, then once a month. But I would look at the hive and check, see if you see mites. If you can go to the drone, when you pull out a frame and you find drones, take a toothpick out there, pop the lids off of about 10 or 12 of the drones and pull them out. Look at them. Most of the time with a naked eye, you can see a little freckle looking, a red freckle on them or 2 or 3. You got mites. Another thing is if you don't have much drone comb, is look at the wings. Hold the frame up and look on an angle. And just kind of hold it down to your waist and tilt it out at 45 degrees from your body and look on an angle. If you see a lot of wings that are kind of frayed looking, like they've been singed, you got mites.
Okay. Well, and you've also made the point that when you treat with oxalic acid, it does not affect the brood that's already been capped, and that's why you would want to treat once every 2 weeks, so you break the mite cycle.
Right.
Yeah, and then after 3 treatments, so that'd be a month and a half. You're thinking once every 3 weeks to a month after that.
Right. And I had somebody had sent me a thing, I guess it was on Facebook, is how safe it was if you left your honey on. If you're doing the vaporizing, you can do it with open honey, open brood, or it doesn't matter. But now, if you're doing dribbling, I do not even teach dribbling method because that does kill your brood. It can contaminate honey. So that's why on the dribble method, there's several people that promote it, and they'll tell you right up front is wait till fall when the brood cycle is winding down and treat when you have the least amount of brooding there. That's why I think the vaporizing is far superior of any treatment. It's the cheapest and the most effective way.
Right. The device is a little bit of money up front, but it's definitely well spent. Um, let's see. Bill says, going back to aggressive bees and why bees get aggressive, he's had a problem lately with his bees kind of getting really, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. And he's going to put up a game cam and apparently he's got a yard where he can do that. And that'd be a pretty good idea. Just have whatever come through there. It'll take a picture of it, and then you'll know what your problem is. If it's a possum or a skunk or a coon or something like that. That's not a bad idea.
I would check around the hive. I'd get down on your knee and look up underneath that bottom board. A lot of times it's a visible sign. And if you've got a skunk or a possum, look at the front of the hive and look at the landing board in the front. It'll have scratch marks on it. That's a good indication, you got it. Or look for pawing marks around the hive. Sometimes you'll find a lot of that where they swat the bees coming out. They swat them with their paw and they drop on the ground and they're taking their paw and picking them up and they got these scratch marks on the ground.
How would you get rid of those, by the way, if you had a queen? I guess putting them up about knee high or waist high would help, wouldn't it, Don?
Well, it does that. It helps keep for your predators, also for a moisture problem. We get people that come up with a lot of different problems and stuff like that. And I had one of my students that's got a double deep, and he said it's boiling over with bees, and he said it's the meanest hive he's got in the whole yard. So he come up and he bought some queens, and he said, I'm going to kill that queen. I'm going to get rid of her. I said, I think your problem is that the hive is so overpopulated, she's got no place to lay, and the disposition of the hive is going downhill. I've seen many a case where you can take that queen out, take one frame of brood with the queen, put her in a nuke, put 4 frames of new foundation in there, take her off, screen it up for 24 hours, and you go back there in 3 weeks and you'll think you've got a brand new queen, full hive of bees, and it's nice and gentle, and then requeen or split the hive that's boiling over. He was going to split his double deep 3 times or 4 times, make 4 splits off of it. That's how populated it was.
It sounds like it
Once
was
you get
doing well. Too much
populations, the bees
success.
are a lot more aggressive. It's just like you go to a ballpark and you sit in the auditorium or you sit in the bleachers and you don't have people up against you, but you go to one game and they're just packed so tight they're almost on your lap, banging in you, stepping on you. You get aggravated too because of the crowd.
Right, that's an excellent point. Okay, Malcolm's got a question. Some people tell me you can requeen by putting a queen cell in the honey super away from the old queen and let her hatch and go mate. Then her smell is stronger than the old, and they accept her. And I guess either the old queen is still there doing her thing, or they have a fight and she dies. What do you think about that, Don?
Well, I'd make a lot of splits with just honey. 5 frame box with 1 frame of honey, a ripe queen cell, and shake some bees in there. But to put a virgin queen or a queen cell in a hive that's got a queen without a queen excluder, they're going to fight, and you might end up losing both of them. And if you've got a queen excluder, and if you're running 4.9 bees, which is a small cell bee, the standard queen excluder will let the queen get halfway through there, and she's going to get stuck, so you're going to lose a queen that way.
That's a good point. How many years can you use? This question comes from Debbie. How many years can you use the same comb for brood? How often should it be replaced? And she says that she's using a wax foundation.
I would go 3 years. Or, go look at the comb. If it looks like a dark chocolate colored or coffee colored, then it's time to start rotating it out. Do a couple frames in each hive. You can do 2 frames or 3 frames every other month, and the bees are going to, use the frames you pull to make splits with. And then when the bees hatch out, then melt it down. So you're not losing nothing, you're gaining nukes.
All righty. I have one here from Malcolm. He says, if you just want about 10 cells, I assume he means queen cells, how well does it work to use the 2-inch strip pointed down between 2 frames with killing off every 2 workers for a cell, I believe is what he says? That makes sense, Don?
Well, I've done 2 or 3 different methods of just making, queen cells. I think what he's talking about is you cut a 2-inch strip of foundation out of a frame that's got brood larvae on that and turning it upside down vertically and putting it between 2 frames. Well, once you do that, they're going to draw queen cells, and sometimes you're going to draw triplets or doubles together. It's hard to cut them apart, so what you're just going to have to do is hope for the best. On a strip that's 16 inches long, you're probably going to get 8 to 10 cells. And if they're doubles, cut them out a 2-inch piece, And if there's 3 queen cells there, just go in every 15, 20 minutes when you put them in and see when they hatch. First one out, then move the cell. Move it to now. We do that here. Sometimes we get doubles and triples together, and it's just hard to cut them apart.
Right, but no need to waste them. Just go ahead and
Right.
just watch them. They were all hatched. It's funny that how the clock works on that. How they're all gonna come out almost in series like that, so you can get away with it. Debbie's got a question about oxalic acid. She says that she finds that it's cheap and effective, but she's wondering what the mortality rate is. Now, to put that in terms, let's ask this: what is the mortality rate of the bees? How many bees does it kill? But how many mites does it kill too?
Well, if she's talking about when you vaporize a hive, the overall hive, how many you're losing, or how many bees die by dropping into the cooking element, which is we put the oxalic acid. I have seen as many as 3 bees, sometimes 4 bees in there. I mean, you got an element that's going to get basically red hot because it's boiling oxalic acid to make a vapor out of it. But as far as a hive overall, I don't think you could even accumulate a 0.5% that's going to hurt. I mean, I've seen bees come out and they look like they're ghost white from the oxalic acid vapors over them. They go out, fly around, groom themselves, come back, they're fine.
Right. What's the mortality rate on the mites, though? How effective is it? Not the mites in the cells. We already identified that closed up cells aren't going to get affected, but on the bees themselves, how effective is it?
Well, I personally don't believe in doing mite counts. I got other things to do with my time. But I've had students that, have stuck sticky boards in there afterwards, and they say it is just covered with mites. And then they'll go back and do it 7 days later, and they only find 3 or 4. So I would say the mortality rate on oxalic acid is darn near 100%, but it's not going to do any good for any bees that are sealed with caps on. You have to wait till they're hatching and, they're exposed to the oxalic acid.
Right. Hence the treatment every 1.5, 2 weeks, and then,
Right.
Once a month. Now, to integrate that with the mineral oil fogging, how you just kind of do that, like 1 week you'll treat with oxalic and then maybe the next with fogger. How do you work that, Don?
Well, I I have a learning yard here, so I teach a lot of different methods. And it's basically the same as if you've got a cold. Are you going to take an antibiotic today? Next week, I'll just try a Tylenol, and then the third week, I'll use an Advil, and then, the following week, penicillin. I mean, you have to do something and stick with one program to see what the effectiveness is. Bees are not going to get immune to oxalic acid or mineral oil. It's just some people don't want to use one treatment because, they have their beliefs in this and that. But I've had students and I've had customers come here 2 and 3 years ago, and I show them the unit, I show them how it works. And I don't think I want to do it. The amount of money is too much. They'll come back in 3 or 4 weeks and they've lost 3 or 4 hives. And I'll say, how much did you put a value on one hive? And you was worried about how much that unit cost. But you'll stick these chemicals in there, and that's $10 a hive, $15 a hive, and they're buying this stuff in the boxes of it. Oxalic acid is the cheapest, safest way, and it's been approved here in the United States finally. And it's the chemical companies that fought it for years and years because you can treat a hive for basically a couple pennies. They want to sell you some chemical you can stick in there, and they make a 99+% profit on the product they're selling you. And Coumaphos is basically a nerve agent that was used in the 40s during the war. And the other one, the aspartame, is not as good, but it's still a chemical.
Right. It still comes from a chemical company, and it's probably in an insecticide class rather than the oxalic acid, which is wood bleach.
It's basically like, people say, well, all I'm going to do is do powder sugar treatments. Well, powder sugar treatments, even colleges have done studies on it. It does knock mites off. There's nobody out there that says powder sugar has ever killed a mite. All I see it it's doing is just increasing the ant load in your beehive, because if you're using screen bottom boards, it's going on through the hive. Now you've got an ant problem, and then pretty soon the ants are in the beehive. It's one thing after another. The vaporizer is the best. The fogger would come second. The fogger, you can do it once a week. It's a lot less to buy a fogger, and it's cheap to run, $1.70 a pint for mineral oil. It's basically a laxative, not hurting the bees one bit. It's a very slow way to kill mites. The oxalic acid is a lot faster. Powder sugar, it'll knock mites off, but you know, you need to do it about every 4 or 5 days, and then you still got the ant problems. It's just what a person wants from their bees. You know, if you got 2 hives and you want to play, or 3 hives and you want to play around and see what works, what don't work, you can do these things. But you got 20, 30 hives, you've got a little investment there. If you start losing 2 hives at a time, that gets into the pocket pretty quick.
And as a follow-up, Debbie said that she has used or had good luck with something called MAQS. Do you know what that is?
And I've heard of it. I've never used it. It's basically another form of treating the bees. There's lots of treatments out there. I mean, how much a person wants to spend? What's the reputation of the product they're using?
Right. Okay. Well, let's unmute Les, and he's got a question for you here. Les, go ahead and you're unmuted. Go ahead and ask your question, Les.
Don, can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you.
Don, I hate to ask very simple questions sometimes, but the subject that you were on with Malcolm, where you cut the 2-inch strip, that video to make queen cells, I have watched that video several times over and was very fascinated with it and want to do it. Now, when you cut that strip, do you press that down between 2 frames of a queenless hive, or would you put that in a hive with a queen already in it?
The beauty part of that is you can put it in a hive that has a queen, but you have to go back in there and check it in a minimum of 12 days. Because from the time you put it in there, the queen is going to hatch from an egg in 16 days. And if the bees decide to pick some larvae in there that's 3 days or 4 day old and they start making queen cells, you got queens could be coming out early. So you have to take you might have an older one in there. And anytime there's a cell vertically, the bees start to make queen cells. I mean, there's a lot of techniques out there, the Miller method, the Doolittle. I mean, you can name it. You can almost turn a hive sideways, and the bees are going to start making queen cells because the frames are on a 45-degree angle. I mean, once the frame gets, or your cells get in a vertical position, they start feeding it as queen cells.
To check those cells, do you pull out 2 frames at a time then to check those, or how would you do that?
You pull 2 frames up and then you just kind of lean them apart, because where it's basically stuck between the frames, you spread your frames apart. What you're doing is cutting a 2-inch strip across a frame that's got brood and larva, and you're spreading your frames apart and you're sliding it down so that the cells are straight up and down. And then you put your lid on, and the weight of the lid holds it in place. It's not going to, there's an inch, I believe it's an inch and a 7/8 to an inch and 1/16 between the frames on any size box, whether it's 5-frame, 8-frame, or 10. That's why when you slide all your frames to one side or the other, there's always a gap. That gap is designed for a queen cage. So if you spread the frames apart and put that strip in there, it's about the right size. Now, I done another video when I was back doing grafting, and we had a young guy there. Then we had a couple old guys there, and they was my age, and they said, "Well, grafting like that's fine. You can see. We got macular degeneration. We can't see. We got really bad vision." So I said, "Look, I can put a blindfold on you, and if you just listen to what I tell you, you can make queen cells." That's where I took a regular queen cell bar. I cut a 1-inch strip of comb, and I stood it up on the bar, and I took my thumb and I pressed it down every inch so that I had the frame, the wax was stuck to the bar. I put it on a frame, or the queen cell bar went back into the frame and put it in the hive. I said, now those cells are in a vertical position. You're going to get at least half of those to take. And I said, if you got backyard beekeeping 2 or 3 hives, you're going to get 5 or 6 queen cells. And if you only want 1 or 2, that's the easiest way. And you don't have to see the larva. The bees do the work. So there's a lot of things when I'm teaching, I alter it to the person. If you got bad vision, there's another way. It's not economically possible or feasible to do it on large scale because you want to graft, you want to do 200 or 300 queen cells on a frame.
Thank you, Don. I really appreciate what you do on these videos.
Okay. I'm just trying to help everybody get ahead a little bit.
Okay, so Joe's got a question again. Joe, you're on the air. Go ahead, ask your question.
Yeah, Don, you catch a swarm out here away from your bee yard, so you know they're not your bees. Do you worry about bringing a disease in and you keep them quarantined away from your other hives for a while? Do you get a chance to check things out, or don't worry about it?
If you got a swarm, I wouldn't worry very much about disease. Now, it's different if you did a cutout or got a hive of bees from somebody else, then I would set it in what you call a nursery yard. But a swarm of bees, there's people that's done studies with that foul brood. I'm not a believer in it. They've had hives that had foul brood, and what they're claiming is if you took all the bees and shook them off all the comb and put them all on new foundation, that the foul brood would not be transferred. I never bought that idea. I personally, if I had foul brood, I would burn the hive. I wouldn't try to medicate it because it's going to pop back up when you least expect it.
How prevalent is foul brood in your lifetime? You had very many cases of it?
I seen it back in the late 50s up into about the middle of the 60s. Then I haven't seen it probably since about early 80s. I might have seen one case of it. And that's just with people that's got one or two hives. And when you get talking to the people, they've got used equipment from a friend that had hives that died. They didn't know why they died. And they just put the stuff up in storage and decided they didn't want to do bees, so they give them to somebody else, and they didn't know the history of them, and they put bees in them, and then it just reappeared. The spore cells live 80 years in that wood.
So if you're watching your hives and pretty hygienic with everything, not much chance.
Well, watching your hive and being hygienic, it's not the thing so much. It's if bees, you get bees from another hive. If you got bees from, say, a guy come over and visit you and he got a dead hive on the back of his truck and it had foul brood and there's no honey flow and your bees get up there and start robbing on his hive, you're going to get foul brood if it had foul brood. But somebody had sent me an email about they thought they had foul brood. They did that little rope test and stuck the toothpick in there and said, they asked if my advice if I would burn it. And I said, being a new beekeeper, the first thing I would do is I would send a sample off and get a professional opinion before I'd done anything. And if it came back positive, I'd definitely burn it. I wouldn't try to salvage it.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Alrighty, Joe. Debbie Martin says, now, Debbie, I assume what you mean here is coming into winter. She says, how many supers do you put on at one time? I only put on one, but I've heard that it should be a minimum of 5 supers. What do you recommend?
The more supers you put on, the more space the bees have to heat. And you might put 5 on in the springtime, but I've never seen a beekeeper put 5 on in the fall. You want to take supers off in the fall, you put them on in the springtime. And you never put 5 on at a time in the spring, you put 1 at a time. And when it's 3/4 full, you add another. You never put 5 at one time. Whenever you put too many supers on a hive at any one time in the spring, you cause what they call demoralization of the bees. You give them too much area to work, and they'll just up and leave. You put one box on, and when they get that kind of full or halfway, then you add another one. Or pull that frames that's sealed off and put another one on.
Can you just, if you decided that, well, I'm just going to take out full frames of honey or almost full frames of honey and just put back blank ones, could you just continue to use whatever amount of supers you had on there?
Yeah, sure. I do that here a lot of times.
Right. So it's more if you're into honey production and you're trying to get time is money, like you said, and you're trying to get this stuff over to the honey yard and let somebody, or honey house or whatever it is, and let somebody else do the extracting. It's easier to swap supers than it is to swap frames, but you could certainly do it if it's just a small mom and pop type operation?
A lot of times what I do is I use a wheelbarrow and I'll put one super in there or I'll put two supers. I'll turn a lid upside down and put a super in or two supers and another lid to cover it. And as I go down the rows, I'm working my hives. If I got a frame that's sealed, I'll pull it out, put another frame back in. And I keep it covered as I walk to the bee yard. Then take
Right,
the
no
wheelbarrow
robbing.
back to the honey house. I mean, that keeps the robin down and everything else.
And once bees get into this kind of bandit mentality, if you leave honey out and they start robbing, will they then start robbing each other's hives too?
Well, you know, I've had that happen. You know, it was brought up at bee clubs and that. And I had seen that quite a few years ago. When a guy told me how he stopped it, I laughed at him, but I actually tried it. I had a bee yard that had about 40 hives in it, and they started robbing. I had a couple of stacks of honey supers out there uncovered, and they started robbing. And I tried exactly what he said, and it stopped within 5 minutes. As I went around in every hive, I took the lid off, opened, exposed the hive, and every bee in the air started heading back to their own house to protect their own goods.
That's a good method. Yeah, it's like, well, fine, you're going to rob somebody else. We're going to let yours be robbed too. And suddenly the alarm goes out. Hey, they're robbing
Yeah.
us now.
Yep.
All righty. Well, we got one more
Time
question.
to head out of here, so
Yeah.
let's get one or two more questions.
We got just one more apparently.
Okay.
A beekeeper, let's see. What was the question? Oh, a beekeeper I know told me he routinely treats his bees with an antibiotic in the fall. He says it helps prevent diseases. And I know, Don, that you use a lot of essential oils, but I'll let you answer that. And she says, I don't agree with this. What do you think, Don?
Well, that's why at the beginning I said that I like to put tea tree oil in as to keep down your chalk brood and stone brood. It's an antibacterial, antifungal. But to tell you the truth, if a beekeeper come up to me and told me he had a bunch of beehives that he was going to sell me really cheap, and he treated them in the fall with antibiotics, I wouldn't touch them. Because the antibiotics, first of all, is impregnated into the wax. It's contaminated. And if you treat your hives with antibiotics constantly, you get a resistance there, and then pretty soon you got more sicker bees. If you think you're going to get gangrene of the leg, you're not going to take massive doses of antibiotics to prevent it. You don't treat for something you don't have. And to treat for putting terramycin or tylosin or any antibiotic into a hive is just plain foolhardy.
Right. And one final question. Mark Rendell, all the way from UK, he says he's got open cells in his supers that have nectar in them, or that's, I guess the bees are still putting away nectar. Will the bees seal them before they cluster for winter?
Most of the time they do, but it doesn't have to be sealed. I mean, if he wants to extract it, I mean, he could take a frame up if he wants to extract. And the old way the beekeepers did is they took the frame sideways and shook it a little bit and see if any of the honey or the nectar would fly out or drip out. If it didn't, with a light shaking on it, the moisture was out of it enough you could use it, extract it and can it or whatever you want to do with it. But it doesn't hurt the hive to have. In fact, in a hive, they're going to have a certain amount of uncapped honey ready to feed the young bees all the time.
All right. Well, I guess that's it, guys. This will be up on YouTube as soon as I get it over to Don, and we'll go from there. Have a great weekend, everybody.
All right. Appreciate everybody showing up.
Bye-bye now.
Jeff.
Bye-bye.